Maybe I'm alone in this feeling, but it often seems like summer is over even while it's happening. I feel so conscious of the fleeting light when the sun is at its brightest. There's something about the concentrated intensity of memories that rise on the air of this season, shimmering like heat devils, that has the effect of telescoping a life, igniting its thread like a fuse. So right now it's the 12th of August. It's coming up to the end of my summer break, so I've taken a little trip to Dolny Śląsk, Lower Silesia, which is one of my favourite parts of Poland. I'm just above a little village called Wleń, and it's fairly close to the Czech border. I think it's an absolutely beautiful place. I'm going to have a little bit of time here to read, so I've taken some books with me, mostly things that I've just really wanted to get around to for quite a while but haven't managed to, and I thought it would be nice to keep you up to date with what I find myself reading. I do truly love it in this part of the country. I think the landscape is just utterly spectacular. And interestingly, the last time I was here, around 2 years ago, I made a video, it's one of my favourites actually, about the diminishing pleasure of reading, about how when you're a young person encountering books for the first time, there's a kind of overwhelming sense of discovery that necessarily dissipates somewhat over time. But as I grow older, I find that one of the things that grows in its ability to sort of nourish my soul, as it were, is being in nature. And so I just love coming to the countryside whenever I can, especially to places like this. I mean, just look at this place. Even its soundscape is nourishing somehow. So I don't know how much it's going to show up on camera, but it might be apparent that I've caught a little bit too much sun. And that's because yesterday I went swimming at a lake in Bukówka, which is really close to the Czech border in the mountains, and stupidly didn't wear any sun cream. I feel particularly ridiculous because I just came back from 10 days in Spain, perhaps an even whiter shade of pale than when I left to go there, and somehow managed to get burnt by the Polish sun, but there you go. So I've had a little bit of time to read, and I'm currently halfway through Lolly Willows, which is Sylvia Townsend Warner's first novel, published in 1926, and is also my first book by this particular writer. And I'm enjoying it immensely. I love that it has both this tremendous delicacy and elegance of style, but is also very unhurried about progressing its story. As I said, I'm about halfway through, and it feels like the main events of the narrative are just beginning. But I love that patience in a writer, and it feels particularly apt given the patience that the main character herself has displayed in responding to her own desires, her own emotions and yearning, and has spent so much time responding to those of others instead. Yeah, so it feels perfectly appropriate somehow. Lolly is a character ill understood by everyone around her. She has trouble finding a place in family life. In almost every context, she fails to fit in. As a girl, she's too young to play with her older brothers.
Growing up, she shows little interest in social attainments. She never marries nor shows any inclination to. She is regarded as plain, her skin tending towards sallowness. Her imagination is, however, captured by the solitary pursuits of botany and brewing. We're told that she roves the countryside for herbs and simples, and many were her washes and decoctions that she made from sweetgale, water purslane, cowslips, and the roots of succory. After her father's death, she is farmed out to live with her older brother in London as a caretaker for his children. Despite her affinity for nature, she finds herself in the capital, living an urban life that caters to everyone's needs but her own.
So instead of being concerned with the advancement of the narrative, the book seems far more attentive somehow to the texture of life, and to the environment of the main character, and particularly to the material objects that comprise it. And again, it feels very appropriate given Lolly Willowes' deep sensitivity to her environment and the very stark division between family life in the city and her former life in the country and her desire to return to it. The main character is sort of drawn to the fragrant, earthy tactility of country life, to the feeling of one's hands in the earth, or the knowledge of herbs and plants and so on. There's some hint about where this will be heading, but for the moment I find it quite extraordinarily poetic somehow.
This affinity Lolly feels for nature is not entirely extinguished by her life in London. While she's waiting in a queue at a greengrocer's, her imagination takes flight from her urban environment, rooting itself once again in bucolic soil.
Laura looked at the bottled fruits, the sliced pears in syrup, the glistening red plums, the green gages. She felt a great longing. It weighed upon her like the load of ripened fruit upon a tree. She forgot the shop, the other customers, her own errand. She forgot that she was in London. She forgot the whole of her London life. She seemed to be standing alone in a darkening orchard, her feet in the grass, her arms stretched up to the pattern of leaves and fruit, her fingers seeking the rounded ovals of the fruit among the pointed ovals of the leaves. The air about her was cool and moist. There was no sound, for the birds had left off singing and the owls had not yet begun to hoot. No sound, except sometimes the soft thud of a ripe plum falling into the grass, to lie there a compact shadow among shadows.
One thing I really love about the book is the degree to which its language modulates according to its subject matter. So when it's describing Lolly's life in London with her conservative family, the style maintains a kind of ironic distance. But when her thoughts turn to the countryside, or perhaps something indistinct and maybe spiritual associated with it, that ironic detachment in the style kind of drops away, and it gives way to something far more lyrical and sensuous, and perhaps more reflective of deeper emotional impulses. It's really beautifully done, I think.
While her body sat before the first fires and was cosy with Henry and Caroline, her mind walked by lowly seaboards in marshes and fens, or came at nightfall to the edge of a wood. Her mind was groping after something that eluded her experience, a something that was shadowy and menacing, and yet in some way congenial, a something that lurked in waste places that was hinted at by the sound of water gurgling through deep channels and by the voices of birds of ill omen. Loneliness, dreariness, aptness for arousing a sense of fear, a kind of ungodly hallowedness. These were the things that called her thoughts away from the comfortable fireside.
It feels somehow really appropriate to be reading it in this environment.
A village nearby where I'm staying, Siedlęcin, is home to an extraordinary building, a 14th century tower once home to the Silesian Duke Henryk I Jaworski. As impressively kept as it is, the interior houses something even more wonderful. On its second floor, the walls are adorned by polychromes, one of which depicts Sir Lancelot from the stories of King Arthur. The images date from between the 1330s and 1350s, making them the earliest examples of such depictions. Even more unbelievably, the images were discovered accidentally by a tax inspector in the late 19th century. It's an incredible manifestation of the wide transmission of the legend. At a local market the next day, I met a guy from London who overheard me speaking English on the phone. He remarked that if such a place were in England, it would be swarming with tourists. Here it stands almost empty. I go on to the village of Sokołowsko, where the filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski lived with his family in this home in the 1950s. The village was also home to Hermann Bremer, a German physician who, in the late 19th century, set up the now partially ruined Bremersche Heilanstalt für Lungenkranke, the first sanatorium that offered systematic open-air treatment for patients with tuberculosis. The building is currently an art gallery, its works housed amid the dilapidation and detritus. One stumbles upon the occasional sculpture in between the crumbling brickwork, scaffolding and plastic sheeting. Just up the hill is the diminutive but ornate Orthodox Cerkiew. It's closed while I'm there, so I'm unable to get inside. But a glimpse through the gate reveals the interior's vivid blues, golds and reds, its gallery of icons.
So today is the 15th of August, and I just finished reading Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, and I found it absolutely magical, I have to say. There's a wonderful, almost life-affirming quality about it, maybe even a wholesomeness, which is not something I often find in the literature that my tastes tend towards. It's not that exclusively, but it's definitely an important part of it for me.
There's a sense of measured progression as the reader accompanies Lolly, or Laura as she prefers to be known, on her journey of self-discovery, especially after the point at which she makes her decision to leave the city and take up residence in Great Mop in the Chilterns. The reader follows her on long walks through the countryside, or under the dappled light of beech forests, and as one follows her, one feels the incremental expansion of her consciousness and her soul.
And a huge part of that journey towards self-discovery comes about through a sort of growing intimacy between Laura and her chosen landscape. It's brought out really beautifully by Sylvia Townsend Warner that there's a quality in the landscape, or there's something in the landscape that only those who are most attuned to it can perceive. It's figured even sometimes as a voice that only some people can hear, and Laura, or Lolly, gradually becomes able to perceive this. It's drawn remarkably well, I think. And when the book makes its sort of leap into the fantastic at around 2/3 of the way through, which is remarkable in itself, I think, there's no sense of it being jarring whatsoever or feeling like a transition in style. It feels very fluent and organic, which is, again, utterly fitting given that gradual growth of the process in Laura herself.
Witchcraft and devilry seem very much at home in this novel, and they're handled with quite an extraordinary lightness of touch. They're approached with tenderness and even comedy at times, despite the underlying seriousness of their import.
And for me, the ideas of witchcraft and devilry in the book, for all the groundedness with which they're treated, they feel like they have an explicitly metaphorical import in the book, and that they are associated really strongly with the idea of emancipation. And for Laura, the compact with the devil seems to be an expression of the first opportunity to truly express her individuality, not to live at the behest of any other, or to compromise her own impulses to those of any other, but a chance to live in a world of thought and imagination and perhaps most of all sensation.
I was reminded very much of the Robert Eggers film The Witch, and particularly of the famous encounter with the devil when he asks his ultimate question.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
To me, this felt like a recasting of a particular moment from Lolly Willows, when the protagonist explains the appeal of the compact with the devil, and the way in which it rises above the petty concerns of everyday life.
And think, Satan, what a compliment you pay her, pursuing her soul, lying in wait for it, following it through all its windings, her soul, when no one else would give a look at her body even. And they are all so accustomed, so sure of her. They say, "Dear Lolly, what shall we give her for her birthday this year? Perhaps a hot water bottle? Or what about a nice black lace scarf? Or a new workbox? Her old one is nearly worn out." But you say, "Come here, my bird, I will give you the dangerous black night to stretch your wings in, and poisonous berries to feed on, and a nest of bones and thorns, perched high up in danger where no one can climb to it." That's why we become witches.
Yeah, it's a truly wonderful and remarkable book, I think. I enjoyed reading it so much, and I recommend it heartily and unequivocally. And I feel thrilled to have been able to read it in such an appropriate environment. As for what I'm reading next, I'm going to return to an author whose work I've enjoyed enormously in the past, and I'm going to read Michael Wehunt's new collection, The Inconsolables, which came out just a little bit earlier this year. Yeah, I'm very excited to experience once again his mode of tender and emotional, slow-paced horror. I enjoyed it so much in his previous collection, Greener Pastures, so I can't wait to dig into this one and see how much there is to enjoy about it. I'm also thrilled to find that a tradition from the previous collection has been carried on, and that Michael Wehunt has decided to include the story notes, a little bit of commentary on each of the stories. And often there'll just be a little explanation of what the writer was attempting, or perhaps what some of the influences were, or maybe about a person for whom the story was written. But to me, they express a tremendous generosity of spirit. There's a real openness about their inclusion, I think. It reminds me of something that Simon Armitage said about taking his friend to a poetry reading. And after the reading, he asked his friend what he thought, and his friend said, well, I liked the bits when the poets were talking about their work more than I liked the poems. And he wondered why those parts were not included in the published books. And that's not something I entirely sympathize with, but I think that perhaps there's a kind of closed quality about literary culture that could do with a little bit of opening up, and that perhaps the story notes in Michael Weehunt's collections are an example of that. So it's something I appreciate.
I carry this region's rich colour palette in my mind, its vivid greens and golds, its afternoon light that stains the land with bronze and copper fire, its lambent fields. This place exists for me in a state of perpetual summer, a kind of luxuriant, fecund stasis, immune to the changes of the seasons, its memory sustaining me through grey and interminable Varsovian winters. Its natural beauty is balanced by its density of crumbling German architecture. It seems that over each hill, some curious edifice just demands to be investigated.
So right now I'm about 15 kilometers outside the town of Wałbrzych, and there's something quite amazing here that I'd really like you to see. So let's go and have a look. Okay, here we go.
This ruined palace in the village of Mokrzeszów, formerly Kunzendorf, on the outskirts of Wałbrzych, has a rather murky history. Its original owner left it in his will to the Knights of Malta, a Catholic lay religious order, intending it to function as a hospital. During the First World War, it offered treatment to German pilots, and later became a sanatorium. It is in the lead-up to the Second World War that the thread of the building's story begins to fray. While I can find no highly credible source for the information, there's a widely held theory that the building was taken over by the Nazi association and eugenics program Lebensborn, which set up maternity homes to foster selective breeding, often by recruiting SS officers, or so-called Zeugungshelfer, procreation helpers, to impregnate young women and ensure the racially pure future of the Reich. The dark history of Lebensborn later includes the kidnapping of children from across Eastern Europe, Norway and the Baltic states. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler spoke in reference to these children of the good blood that could be of use to Germany, and of destroying the blood that could not. Being aware of this history gives a certain menacing quality to the silence of this place. Later in the evening, the close heat of the day opens like a sluice gate and lets loose the flood. The storm moves away into the reddening horizon, the rain sketching pale black wraiths in the middle air.
The air is so much lighter today after yesterday's storm. It feels like something broke in the sky to let the fresh air through. And it's been raining a lot today. It feels somehow appropriate that the weather should darken and start to cool alongside my reading of Michael Wehunt's The Inconsolables, which I've been enjoying immensely. So far it more than lives up to its predecessor. And I definitely have some favourites that I want to talk about, so I'm going to catch up with you tomorrow to discuss them in a bit more detail. So in a lot of ways, The Inconsolables feels like a continuation of the style of Greener Pastures. It has that same implementation of very emotional or very personal sources of horror. Its stories are populated by grieving characters or characters who have experienced some profound loss or are in the midst of experiencing it. And Wehunt allows the horror to sort of creep stealthily out of the peripheries of these emotional states, or in some cases to sort of leap out of them. And that's something that's very interesting to me, and it reminded me a lot of M.R. James's ability to allow a well-placed image or a well-placed line to carry this huge burden of terror in the midst of a kind of serenity, like a wave, a crashing wave suddenly emerging from a calm sea. Yeah, it's very impressive, I think. Just as James might employ such jarring, striking images as a lungless laugh or a face of crumpled linen, Wehunt at times seems to wield the same sharp implement. A face becomes a smudge smeared by a thumb. A briefly glimpsed figure displays its broken antlers, tipping forward like stains in the light. I really enjoyed the opening story, Vampire Fiction, which reminded me quite obliquely perhaps of that wonderful Klein story, The Events at Porth Farm, particularly in the protagonist's isolation and his examination or research into the history of genre fiction. But I also love that it mines these fears from childhood and allows them to blossom when the protagonist reaches this very vulnerable state after being left by his wife and child. That sense of regression is evoked really well, I think. Another example of that extrapolation from emotional states is the third story, Caring for a Stray Dog, which treats the loss of a child due to a school shooting, but it's very sensitively handled, and it's a extraordinarily atmospheric story, I think. One of my absolute favourites so far, though, has to be the Pine Arch collection, which is a sort of found footage story, and it has connections to another story from the previous collection called October Film Haunt, Under the House. And it's told via a sort of series of interconnected email threads that grow in intensity. They grow very steadily in intensity, from a kind of mild discomfort to this sort of grainy, black and white, static pitch of pure horror. In the story notes, Michael Wehunt talks about asking himself how to make emails scary, and I think he absolutely succeeds in this story. The imagery that Wehunt employs is also quite extraordinarily disturbing. The whole story has the feeling, largely due to its structure, of a
pixelated experimental horror clip that you might stumble upon online, unsure how to distinguish between fiction and documentary. Another very fine example of how We Hunt can distill horror from emotional states is the novella-length piece in the collection, I think the longest in it, at least so far, called Tired Sounds Awake. And it depicts a sort of crumbling marriage in which communication has broken down entirely. And it employs this quite overt metaphor, perhaps, of the couple being assailed by these extraordinarily creepy mimes. And in the story notes, We Hunt acknowledges that the metaphor is perhaps slightly on the nose, but also that it's very underused, perhaps. And nevertheless, I find it really effective as this expression of both the sort of chasm that's grown up between the couple, but also the idea that there's a kind of pretense about something being there between them that both of them feel the need to uphold, even when there's simply a great absence there. It also feels somewhat like a literalized idiom, the idea of going through the motions given an expression in the flesh. And it's also reinforced throughout the story by this motif of hollowness and emptiness that permeates its entirety. I found it a very moving piece. Needless to say, I'm really enjoying the collection so far. I hope to finish it soon, whether that's here or back in Warsaw. Today's my last full day in Dolny Śląsk, but either way I'll catch up with you to give you my final thoughts. In the town of Bolesławiec, famous for its own distinctive ceramics, there is a festival of ceramics. Stalls line the streets displaying wares from all over Europe. I'm struck, however, by the folk musicians and dancers in the main square.
Hej, dusa moja, Janice, teraz wojok szukajce. Żandary na wojnę, Janicka już brzmi, teraz płacą mi o wsi. Żandary na wojnę, Janicka już brzmi.
It's hard not to feel that leaving Dolny Śląsk also means leaving summer behind, the landscape consigned to the half-life of memory, the embers of the season still bright, but fading to a dull glow, soon to dissolve into darkness. So I've had some books arrive recently, and I thought it would be nice to share some of them with you. The two I wanted to mention right now are both recommendations from Quinton S. Crisp, who left a nice comment on my video, my recent Q&A video, when I was talking about some of my favourite women writers. And I asked everyone for recommendations. He recommended Precious Bane by Mary Webb, which I don't know very much about, but it certainly looks intriguing. It seems to share some parallels with Sylvia Townsend Warner's Lolly Willows, which I just read, and involves witchcraft and the countryside. This time set in Shropshire, and Thomas Hardy seems to be a touchstone here for the writer of the blurb. So that's definitely an encouraging thing for me. I'm a huge fan of his work.
And the second is In the Shade of Spring Leaves by Higuchi Ichio, which again is entirely new to me, but I'm certainly very interested in it. This edition combines critical biography with 9 of her stories, and I'm told, or Quentin recommended this particular translation, the Robert Lyons Danley translation. Particularly interested because I haven't read very much fiction translated from the Japanese written by women, and particularly not from this period. Higuchi Ichio was born in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, so I think it could be absolutely fascinating to explore. So I'm very much looking forward to that at some point this year. So I've been back in Warsaw for about a week now, back at work too. Feels a little bit like crash landing in reality and trying not to burn up on re-entry. And Dolnośląsk feels quite a long way away now. But I've finished Michael Weehunt's The Inconsolables, so I thought we could find somewhere and have a little chat about it.
I take a little detour through the roof garden of the Warsaw University Library. On quiet days, its outlandish design, which for me is redolent of science fiction from the 1950s and 60s, has a certain atmospheric, alien serenity.
Sorry for the noise of the traffic today. I've had quite a hard time finding somewhere to film, but it's just like that sometimes, I'm afraid. So, as I mentioned, I've now finished Michael Weehunt's The Inconsolables, and I'm really pleased to say that the second half of the collection held quite a few really positive surprises for me, especially in that it sort of expands Weehunt's palette as a writer, I think, both towards the significantly darker end of the spectrum, but also towards the somewhat brighter. And on that very dark side are the 2 stories, the Teeth of America and Is There Still Human Kindness in the World, both of which deal with extremely difficult subject matter. In the former, white supremacy and cults, and in the second, death and sexual violence. The Teeth of America seems to draw its horror from an ideologically divided America, and it's probably the most overtly political of Weehunt's stories that I've encountered. It strikes me as quite an angry story, but a tremendously effective one too. It's interesting structurally as well, so it's sort of woven together from this sort of tapestry of different sources. For instance, like sociological books, academic books, eyewitness testimonies, and even YouTube videos. And the reader sort of gradually intuits the grimness of the situation. And the second story, is there still human kindness in the world, is a sort of disturbing twist or spin on the Cupid myth that is in equal measure distressing and highly moving, I would say. And I enjoyed them both tremendously. Perhaps my favourite story in the collection, and maybe even the finest story that I've encountered by Weehunt, is the closing story called An Ending Ascent. And it sees Weehunt moving outside of the familiar territory of horror and closer to something like science fiction, albeit while maintaining his signature style. And it imagines a world in which aging has been cured but only for that portion of the population that were born before a particular date. Born after a particular date. If they were born before, they become ineligible for the treatment. And the story is told from the perspective of a man born just on the wrong side of that date, and so he's forced to sort of wrestle with his mortality in a world of soon-to-be immortals. And it struck me as particularly powerful because it seems a little bit like a sort of metaphorical intensification of something that many people experience, the knowledge that they are soon to die, and the tremendous feeling of injustice that must come with that. And so it has this wonderfully elegiac quality. It also reminded me quite a lot of Ken Liu's story, Mono no Aware, with which it shares quite a few themes. But also just made me think about that concept of Mono no Aware in general, the idea of the pathos that comes from the ephemerality of things, the transitory nature of life and objects, and the sort of intensification of beauty that results from that idea. And this is partially what you see occurring in the protagonist's relationship with the world, this yearning to remain with it, for it not to change, and it seems to sort of glow so much brighter because he will soon leave it. I found it tremendously powerful, and that's particularly true when he imagines the future discoveries that humankind will make, but knows that he will never be around to experience them, to move beyond the planet Earth and the exploration of the universe. He knows that he'll be left behind.
But I do dream of blue-red skies and coarse, irradiated dirt sifting through my fingers like strange sugar. Places where sound carries forever, and nothing is without heft or cadence. I dream of clusters of moons in choreographed orbit, incalculable distances in an eyedropper, blooming nebulas swapping poetry, star systems without carbon, forms of life stemmed from elements that require certain neurocoding to see, to fall in love with, their skins crackling with anti-light. I dream of the dreams I once shared with my friends, propulsion and re-entry, and streaking across pale skies over miles of gold dancing in our wake.
So overall, I find The Inconsolables a very worthy successor to Greener Pastures, and perhaps I could even say that I enjoyed it slightly more. And I'm really interested and intrigued to find out where Michael Wehunt will go after this. I understand there's going to be a novel coming out at some point in the future, so I'll certainly be checking that out when it's released. So another really cool thing to arrive recently was The Wasteland, a biography of a poem by Matthew Hollis, which I believe was published either this year or last year, and I'm really excited to dig into it because I've been absolutely fascinated by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland ever since the time when I first read it, around the age of 18. I can still recall that sort of gut punch feeling that I had when I first read it, and I remember its language having this tremendous sort of visceral power over me, despite the fact that I wasn't really familiar with anything that it alluded to. I had a very shaky grasp on its historical context or its meaning. But since then, I've read it many times, and I've studied it at university, and I've taught it to some students as well. And yeah, I'm just really intrigued by the idea of the book, a biography of a poem. It's not a form that I've come across before, so I hope that this will really sort of stretch and open up my relationship with it as a text. I'd love to know more about the circumstances of its composition and the editing process that it underwent, which I understand was quite extensive. So yeah, very excited about this. So before I end this little diary, I thought I'd just let you know what's up next in terms of my reading. And I've actually just started this slim volume, The Vet's Daughter by Barbara Cummins. I think that's the way it's supposed to be pronounced. This is actually a recommendation from someone, from an Instagram friend, a daughter of moths, who found the channel quite recently. And so far it feels like a very well-placed recommendation. I'm enjoying it a lot. It has a wonderful sort of grim, gothic, fairy tale-like energy to it. It deals with a young girl living with her tyrannical veterinarian father, and she has this huge imagination that's sort of both confined and nourished by her circumstances. It's fabulous so far. So let me know what you're reading in the comments. If you're reading something particularly exciting or enjoyable right now, I'd love to hear about it. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone, with a bookish friend or somewhere online. It means a lot to me when you do that. I've been asked a lot about ways to support me in the past, and I've sort of shied away from doing that, but recently I set up a Ko-fi account, so if you'd like to support me in a small way, you're very welcome to do it there. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.